She was strung upside down for theft, until a wild horse refused to pull the wagon without her. "I didn't steal anything. Please," she whispered, her voice trembling as her body hung upside down from the wagon pole, ankles bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin each time she shifted. But the only answer she received was the murmur of a gathering crowd. Settlers who preferred judgment over truth, their boots grinding dust into the earth beneath her swaying hair. The blood rushed to her head, blurring her vision and turning the world into a smear of faces and sun glare. Yet through the haze, she could still feel the sting of humiliation more sharply than the pain in her joints, because being strung upside down like an animal was a punishment designed not for justice, but for shame. And shame left marks no rope ever could. The wagon creaked beside her as a teamster climbed onto the seat, slapping the reins of the wild roan horse harnessed to it. An animal so unpredictable that most of the settlement kept a wide berth, a creature born of wind and stubborn will, its dark mane whipping as it pawed the ground with restless power. She turned her head just enough to glimpse it, the upside-down angle making the horse appear enormous, towering, dangerous. And yet when its eyes met hers, the snorting aggression softened into something that shouldn't have been possible. Recognition, or at least curiosity sharpened by empathy rather than fear. The teamster yanked the reins again, calling for the horse to pull, but the roan planted its hooves firmly in the dirt, muscles twitching, ears pinned not backward in defiance but forward toward her, nostrils flaring as if it sensed the panic trembling through her suspended body. The crowd muttered, shifting uneasily as the animal refused a simple command, and the teamster cursed, striking the reins harder in frustration. But the moment the leather snapped against its flank, the horse jerked sideways, not away from her, but toward her, letting out a sharp, cutting whinny that startled even the men closest to the wagon. She flinched, expecting the animal to lash out in the wild unpredictability it was known for, but instead it sidestepped until its shoulder pressed against the wagon pole, the warmth of its body reaching her through the rough wood, its breath gusting across her cheek in a soft, trembling huff that felt more protective than threatening. Confusion rippled through the crowd, their jeers faltering into silence as the wild horse lowered its head toward her dangling form, snorting again with an urgency that seemed to warn the handlers rather than obey them. And in that bewildering, breathless moment, when a creature feared by all refused to move without her, the first crack appeared in the narrative the town had spun about her guilt, though she, still swaying helplessly, had no idea yet how completely this animal's defiance would upend everything they believed. The teamster's face reddened with frustration as he yanked the reins a third time, harder than before, his voice rising in a sharp, angry bark that echoed across the yard. But the wild roan refused even to shift its weight, instead bracing itself more firmly between her and the wagon as if anchoring her against further harm. Settlers exchanged uneasy looks, some muttering that the horse had gone mad, others whispering that no creature that fierce had ever stopped dead in its tracks for a woman accused of theft. And yet none dared step closer, because anyone who had lived long on the frontier knew that a wild animal's instincts rarely lied, even when people did. She tried to speak, to plead again, but the rush of blood to her head stole her words, turning her voice into a weak, broken gasp that barely carried beyond the dust swirling beneath her hair. The man who had accused her, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, with a self-righteous glare, sharpened by pride, pushed through the crowd and jabbed a finger toward her dangling body, shouting, "She hid my knife! I saw her near my wagon before it disappeared!" But the roan tossed its head violently at the accusation, snorting and striking the ground with such force that several onlookers stepped back, hands lifting defensively as though expecting the animal to rear. The accused woman's eyes fluttered, her vision dimming as panic threatened to close in. Yet even in her fading awareness, she sensed something strange. The horse wasn't afraid of the crowd. It was angry on her behalf. When the teamster climbed down in a huff, stomping toward the horse's flank with the intent to force it forward, the roan shifted sideways again, placing its massive body between both humans, breathing harder now, muscles quivering beneath its skin as though communicating a warning none of them yet understood. A rancher who had been watching from the back finally stepped through the crowd, slowing as he approached the scene, his eyes narrowing not at her, but at the roan's unwavering stance. He raised a hand slowly, speaking in a low drawl meant to calm animals, not people. "Easy, boy. Something's got you riled." And the roan flicked an ear toward him, but refused to move away, snorting again toward the bound woman with unmistakable urgency. Whispers grew sharper, speculation turning into doubt, as more settlers realized the horse never reacted to strangers this way, never moved toward anyone without reason, and as she hung helplessly, breaths shallow and heart-pounding, she watched uncertainty ripple through the crowd like a shiver of truth trying to rise, even if no one yet knew how to name it. The rancher lifted both palms slowly, signaling the teamster to back away, but the wild roan didn't spare the men a glance. It kept its gaze fixed entirely on her, ears forward, nostrils trembling as if it could hear something no one else could, some frail thread of panic slipping from her with every shallow breath she fought to take. Upside down, her vision wavered between sharpness and blur, the world spinning in soft pulses. Yet through the dizziness, she saw the horse inch closer, step by deliberate step, until its muzzle hovered just inches from her tangled hair, its breath warm against her temple, steadying her in a way no human voice had managed since the moment she was dragged beneath the wagon pole. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But her eyes opened enough to meet the roan's, and the connection that followed didn't require sound, her terror trembling through the air, the animal's instinct locking onto it with unwavering certainty. The crowd hushed, unsettled by the way the horse dipped its head and nudged her shoulder ever so gently, as though testing the rope, checking her weight, making certain she was still alive. The movement was so deliberate, so protective, that even the teamster froze mid-step, his anger cooling into bewilderment as the animal he'd always called untamable stood guard over the very woman he believed guilty. The roan exhaled sharply, then swung its body sideways, pressing its warm flank against the wagon pole until the wood groaned beneath its weight, the gesture so purposeful that the rancher's expression sharpened into something like dawning comprehension. This was no random agitation, no rebellious refusal to obey, but a silent attempt to steady her, to keep her from swaying as her consciousness flickered on the edge of collapse. A strand of her hair brushed the roan's cheek, and instead of shying away, the animal stilled completely, grounding its hooves as if anchoring the earth beneath her, and in the stunned quiet that followed, she felt, for the first time since the rope tightened around her ankles, something close to safety. Thunder rumbled far off in the distance, but no one moved. Not even the children perched on wagon rails, because what they witnessed was impossible to deny. A wild horse, feared and avoided, offering a kind of wordless comfort to a woman the town had condemned without thought, her lips parted, not to beg now, but to breathe, her eyes softening as she recognized the unspoken truth in the animal's steady gaze. You are not alone. And though she could not lift her hands, could not speak her innocence, the roan's unwavering presence spoke louder than she ever could have hoped. The uneasy murmur sweeping through the crowd thickened as the teamster, red-faced from embarrassment, grabbed a long pole from the side of the wagon and strode toward the roan, muttering about stubborn beasts and broken obedience. But before he could prod the horse aside, the rancher stepped sharply into his path, catching the pole mid-swing with a grip that silenced the yard far quicker than any threat could. The rancher's eyes, clear, steady, trained by years of watching both men and animals with equal scrutiny, shifted toward the roan, then toward the accused woman, still hanging upside down, her breathing shallow and uneven, her face pale beneath the dust streaking her cheeks. The rancher lowered the pole deliberately, releasing it to the ground as he said, "If that animal won't pull, there's a reason, and it's not because of your temper." But the teamster, pride gnawing at what little sense he had left, snapped back, "She's the reason. The horse has gone soft for a thief." The roan answered before the rancher could, stamping the earth so hard the wagon's front wheels lifted an inch from the ground, its head thrown high as a shrill, protective cry tore from its throat, startling chickens from the fence line and sending two men stumbling backward. Those closest to the woman flinched, expecting the horse to lash out, but instead it turned its massive body sideways again, positioning itself between her and the teamster with a clarity no one could misinterpret. The rancher's expression shifted, suspicion knitting his brow as he crouched near the pole she hung from, examining the rope burn around her ankles, the bruises rising along her wrists from where she had been grabbed, the way her eyes fluttered weakly. Not with guilt, but with someone on the edge of losing consciousness. He looked up, scanning the crowd for the accuser, and found the broad-shouldered man already trying to slip behind a group of settlers, hiding the flicker of panic in his eyes. The rancher rose slowly, dusting his hands on his trousers, and said loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "If this woman truly stole from you, show us the proof. Lay it out now." And though the man opened his mouth, no words came. Only a strangled sound of frustration as the settler's attention shifted toward him with growing doubt. Before the silence could harden into accusation against him, the roan nudged the woman again, snorting softly as if urging someone, anyone, to cut her down, and for the first time since the punishment began, the rancher reached for the knife at his belt, not in anger, but in resolve, the blade flashing once in the sunlight as he stepped toward the rope that held her life suspended above the dust. The knife sliced cleanly through the rope, and she dropped only a short distance before the rancher caught her by the shoulders, lowering her gently to the ground as the crowd surged forward in a rippling wave of startled gasps, some rushing to see her face, others stepping back as if afraid the horse might turn its fierce loyalty toward them next. The roan snorted and circled once, then settled beside her with surprising gentleness, lowering its massive head until its muzzle nearly touched her arm, breathing in slow, steady pulses that seemed to guide her own ragged breaths back into rhythm. The rancher eased her upright, supporting her weight with one knee on the dust as he untied the rope from her ankles, wincing at the deep red welts the punishment had carved into her skin. And although she tried to shift away, instinct trained by humiliation, he shook his head and said quietly, "Hold still now. Let me help," his tone carrying a steadiness that made something in her finally stop fighting. He tore a strip from the bottom of his sleeve and wrapped it around her raw wrists, his movements careful, respectful, more like someone tending a wounded traveler than a supposed thief. And she blinked hard, tears burning behind her eyes, though none fell. A woman from the crowd stepped forward hesitantly with a dipper of water, and when the rancher guided it to her lips, she drank in slow, shaky gulps, the coolness hitting her stomach like the first shelter she'd had since dawn. The roan stayed pressed close, its flank warm against her side, and when she lifted a trembling hand to steady herself against the ground, the horse gently nudged its cheek against her fingers, as if insisting she lean on it instead. Murmurs spread again, less accusatory now, more bewildered, and one settler whispered, "That horse won't let anyone near her but him," nodding toward the rancher, who was now checking her bruised ankles for breaks. She flinched at his touch, not from pain but from the unfamiliar feeling of someone handling her with care rather than contempt, and for a moment her breath hitched as though she might cry. Yet she forced it down, swallowing the sound with a practiced resilience he recognized instantly. "Easy," he murmured, lifting his gaze to hers. "No one's hurting you now." And though she didn't answer, her fingers curled faintly into the roan's mane, as if accepting strength from the only creature who had defended her without hesitation. As the rancher helped her onto a crate to sit upright, her vision steadied, and for the first time she saw the crowd not as a wall of hostility, but as a sea of shifting doubt. Faces realizing that the girl they'd strung up might not be a criminal at all, and that a wild horse's fierce refusal had revealed the first fragile crack in the lie that placed her there. As the rancher stepped aside to speak with the murmuring settlers, the yard seemed to quiet around her, the clamor fading until all she could hear was the roan's slow, rhythmic breathing beside her, its warm flank pressing lightly against her shoulder, as though anchoring her to the earth after so many hours suspended above it. She didn't have words, not for the pain still throbbing through her limbs, not for the shock of being cut down, not even for the strange, protective presence of the animal towering beside her. But the roan didn't seem to need them, lowering its head until its forehead brushed gently against the crown of her bowed one, a gesture so deliberate and steady that several settlers gasped softly, hands rising to their mouths as they watched the wild horse show a kind of tenderness none had ever witnessed from it before. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting the roan's dark gaze, and the connection that passed between them was as quiet as it was profound. No plea, no desperation, only the shared relief of two beings who understood what it meant to be feared, misjudged, and still standing. When the rancher returned, ready to ask if she could speak yet, he paused mid-step, struck silent by the sight of her leaning into the horse without flinching, her fingers tangled loosely in its mane as though she had known the animal far longer than the few breathless minutes since it had refused to pull the wagon. The roan shifted slightly to keep her steady when she wobbled, and she felt her throat tighten. Not with fear this time, but with a fragile, unfamiliar warmth that rose through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The crowd watched in hushed awe as the roan curled its neck around her just enough to shelter her from the drying wind, and without speaking a single word, the horse offered the kind of assurance no human in that yard had dared give her, that she was not an object of punishment, not a nameless thief, not forgotten or alone. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, whispering about how the horse knew the truth, while the teamster, once so sure of her guilt, now looked away, chewing hard on regret he didn't know how to voice. The rancher cleared his throat and approached again, softer this time, as though unwilling to disturb whatever bond had settled between her and the roan. And when she finally lifted her gaze to him, the rancher saw something he hadn't before. Not the hollow fear of a woman condemned, but the first steady flicker of someone who might yet reclaim her name, because a wild creature had trusted her before any human dared. When the roan finally eased a step back, giving her room to breathe, the rancher knelt beside her again. But this time he didn't ask anything. He simply waited, letting the quiet settle like dust around them until she could gather the pieces of herself, scattered by fear, humiliation, and the dizzying rush of near collapse. Her hands, still trembling, curled into the horse's mane for steadiness, and when she tried to inhale, the breath caught somewhere deep in her chest, breaking into a soft, involuntary sob that she covered quickly with the back of her wrist, ashamed of the sound even though she no longer hung from a pole above the ground. The rancher shook his head gently, not in reprimand but in understanding, and said in a low voice meant only for her, "You're allowed to breathe now. Nothing's coming for you." But his words cracked open something she had locked tightly inside since dawn, and her tears, hot, sudden, messy, spilled before she could stop them. No one in the crowd jeered now. No one muttered about guilt or shame. Instead, the settlers watched with an uneasy stillness as her voice, rough from hours upside down, finally pushed through her trembling lips. "I didn't steal his knife. I never touched it. I was only near his wagon because—" Her words failed, swallowed by a wave of panic. But the rancher leaned in, steady as bedrock, waiting without pressure. She closed her eyes, gathering strength from the roan pressing its muzzle to her shoulder again, and tried once more. "Because I heard crying. A child. Someone left a boy under the tarpaulin with no blanket. I went to pick him up, that's all. Then the knife went missing, and he blamed me before I could speak." A ripple of shock moved through the settlers, mothers clutching children closer, men exchanging troubled glances. Because the woman they'd strung upside down wasn't a thief, but someone trying to keep a child warm in the early cold. The rancher absorbed her words with a slow exhale, his jaw tightening not in anger toward her, but toward the accuser who had twisted need into wrongdoing. Before he could speak, she continued, voice thin but resolute. "The boy's mother knows. She saw me. But she was afraid to speak against her husband." The roan snorted sharply, as if reacting to the injustice curling through the air, and the rancher rose to his feet with a steadiness that sent a murmur through the crowd. Not loud, not angry, just resolved. He turned toward the settlers and said, "Then we'll hear from her. Today." And though she trembled still, bruised and exhausted, the woman felt, for the first time since being dragged beneath the wagon pole, the first breath of truth finally shifting in her direction. The rancher's call for the boy's mother spread through the yard like a spark on dry grass, and when the woman finally stepped forward, thin, pale, clutching her shawl as though it were the only thing holding her together, the entire settlement shifted, the crowd parting instinctively as if they sensed the truth trembling in her footsteps. She stopped a few paces from the accused woman, eyes red and swollen, and for a moment her courage faltered under her husband's glare from across the yard, his jaw clenching as he barked, "Don't you dare say a word!" But the roan, reacting before any person could, stamped so violently that dust burst beneath its hooves, the sound echoing like a warning crack of thunder, sending children scrambling back and making the accuser stumble in shock. The boy's mother flinched, then lifted her chin with a resolve so fragile it looked like it might shatter at any breath of wind. Yet she spoke anyway, voice trembling but clear enough for every soul present to hear. "She didn't take your knife. I saw what happened. She was holding our son because he was freezing, and you—" Her voice broke, but she forced it back, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "You misplaced your own blade the night before. You were too drunk to remember where you put it." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but the accuser roared in denial, lunging toward his wife in fury. The rancher stepped in instantly, blocking him with a firm hand to the chest, while the roan surged forward in tandem, placing itself squarely between the man and the woman he had wronged, nostrils flaring, muscles coiling as if ready to flatten him if he took another step. Chaos trembled at the edge of breaking. Settlers shouting, the teamster grabbing the reins in a useless attempt to drag the wagon horse away, the accused woman swaying from exhaustion as she clung to the wheel for balance. But the roan held the center with an authority no human could challenge, throwing its head high and releasing a piercing cry that froze every movement in the yard. In the stunned silence that followed, a young boy's voice piped up from the crowd. The accused child, no older than 5, clutching his mother's skirt and holding the missing knife in his tiny hand as he said uncertainly, "Papa, you dropped this under the wagon yesterday." And the weight of that single sentence slammed through the settlement harder than any fistfight could have. The accuser stared, face draining of color, the rancher's glare cutting through him with merciless clarity, and the roan exhaled sharply, stepping back to the accused woman's side as though declaring the crisis settled. Not by force, but by truth finally dragging itself into the light. The yard held its breath as the truth settled, dust drifting in the still air like fragments of a lie finally breaking apart. And all eyes turned toward the woman who had been strung upside down only minutes earlier. No longer as a criminal, no longer as a spectacle, but as someone wronged before the entire settlement. The accuser's face twisted with the dawning realization of what he had done, his shoulders curling inward as though the weight of his own falsehood had finally grown too heavy to carry. Yet before he could speak, the rancher stepped forward, voice firm and carrying across the silent yard. "You punished an innocent woman. You shamed her. And you would have let that lie stand if not for a child's courage, and a horse who saw what we refused to." A ripple of agreement moved through the settlers, some nodding slowly, others stepping closer in guilt or remorse. But it was the boy, small, frightened, still clutching the knife, that walked toward her first, his tiny steps hesitant until he reached her side and whispered, "I'm sorry," in a voice that broke more hearts than any apology from an adult could have. She didn't speak, only lowered her gaze. Overwhelmed, her bruised wrists trembling slightly as she steadied herself on the wagon wheel, but the roan nudged her gently, lifting her chin with the soft push of its muzzle until she met the child's eyes, and the simple act of connection between them softened the air around them like a fragile dawn. The child's mother approached next, tears streaking her cheeks as she folded her hands over her heart, as though offering it in penance, whispering, "I should have spoken sooner. I'm so sorry they hurt you." Her voice thick with regret, and though the accused woman didn't have the strength to answer, the slight shake of her head, quiet forgiveness rather than bitterness, was enough to draw a shuddering sigh from the crowd. The rancher motioned for space, then helped her stand fully, supporting her until her legs found a shaky but determined balance beneath her. And when she straightened, the crowd did something no one had expected. They parted for her, creating a path wide enough for her to walk through without fear, a gesture of public recognition that she had been wronged and that her dignity would be honored now. As she stepped forward, the roan fell into stride beside her, its massive body shielding her from the curious stares, and the people bowed their heads in acknowledgement, some whispering apologies, some simply standing in humbled silence, as though the settlement itself needed her forgiveness to breathe again. And though she didn't speak a single word, the way she lifted her chin, battered but unbroken, told the town everything they needed to know about the kind of woman they had nearly destroyed. Morning crept over the settlement in a soft wash of gold, the kind of gentle dawn that made the previous day feel like a distant storm, rather than something that had nearly broken her body and spirit. And as she stepped beyond the last row of cabins, the cool air lifted the stray strands of her hair, while the roan followed close behind, its hooves thudding in a slow, steady rhythm that felt more like companionship than protection. The rancher had offered her shelter for the night, but she hadn't slept much, the ache in her limbs and the weight of yesterday's injustice pressing against every attempt to rest. Yet when she rose at first light, she found the roan waiting outside the door as if refusing to let her face the world alone. She paused at the fence line, watching the rancher approach with calm purpose, his hat low against the sun, his expression softened from the hardened edge he had carried the day before. And when he reached her, he didn't lecture the crowd anymore, didn't speak of guilt or wrongdoing. He simply asked, "Where do you want to go from here?" With a sincerity that startled her more than the rope ever had. She looked out across the open land, a stretch of quiet hills and winding brush that felt, for the first time, like a place she could breathe without being judged. And she answered not with words, but with a small, steady nod toward the ridge trail leading away from the town that had misnamed her. The rancher didn't argue, only fell into step beside her, keeping a respectful distance as the roan brushed its muzzle against her shoulder again, the simple touch grounding her in a way nothing else had since the ordeal began. Behind them, settlers gathered silently at the edge of the yard. Not crowding, not shouting, just watching with the kind of remorse that didn't know how to speak without sounding clumsy, and though none dared call after her, their lowered heads said enough. They had seen the truth too late, but they would remember it now. As she walked, her breath softened into something steadier, her steps growing less fragile with each passing moment, and the roan gave a low, quiet nicker, as if approving her choice to leave pain behind instead of letting it shape the rest of her life. At the crest of the ridge, she paused and glanced back only once, not in bitterness, not in grief, but in a kind of peaceful acceptance that the world she was stepping toward was larger than the one that had nearly broken her. Then she continued forward with the roan at her side and the rancher a few paces behind, the rising sun warm on her face, carrying the quiet promise that she would never again be unseen, unheard, or misnamed by those who chose judgment over truth. Sometimes the frontier shows its harshest face before it shows its honest one. And sometimes the truth arrives in the most unexpected way, even on four hooves. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and breathe with it. Please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the West for more true-hearted frontier tales. Tell us in the comments, when a whole town believed a lie, would you have stepped forward first or stayed silent like the rest?